All right, get ready to dive deep today, folks, into the achievements of Donald Trump. And we're going to really zero in on his time as president.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You've given us all this material to go through, details on his journey through politics. And I'm thinking maybe we can focus on some of the less talked about things that happened while he was in office.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so easy to just get stuck in, the headlines and the big sound bites, but there's a lot more to unpack here. And so I think a good place to start might be, one of the things that shifted the playing field in a major way, and that's his appointment of 3 Supreme Court justices.
Yeah, right. Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, big names. And I remember those confirmations, whoa, they were pretty intense.
Oh, yeah.
What's the long game there?
Yeah. Well, I think that's what's so interesting about this, right? It tipped the balance of the court, and potentially for decades to come. You think about landmark decisions like, Roe v. Wade, and the ripple effects are still being felt today from that. And so we could see similar shifts in legal interpretations, rulings that shape everything from, social issues to business regulations for years to come, really.
Okay, so that's a major lasting impact for sure.
Yeah.
What other kind of under-the-radar achievements are we looking at?
Well, I think we should talk about the USMCA.
Okay.
Do you remember NAFTA?
Yeah, of course.
You know that big trade agreement that everybody was always talking about?
That behemoth.
Yeah, the behemoth, exactly. Well,
Yeah.
Trump spearheaded, the revamp of that and brought us the USMCA.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that. Was it just a rebranding or were there actual changes made?
No, it was more than just a fresh coat of paint. I
Yeah.
mean, the USMCA brought in, updated rules for digital trade, which of course NAFTA hadn't really anticipated. And it also aimed to boost North American manufacturing, particularly in the auto industry, by tweaking these rules of origin. So, whether those goals were fully achieved is, a whole other discussion, but
Right, the devil's always in the details.
yeah.
But yeah, it sounds like he was tackling some pretty big, complex issues, head on.
Yeah, he definitely wasn't shy about diving into those arenas. And another area that you specifically wanted to explore was his impact on immigration and border security.
Yes. I mean, the wall was impossible to miss in the news cycle, but what about the less flashy parts of his immigration policies?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that often gets overlooked is his focus on interior enforcement. So he actually ramped up efforts to try to locate and deport undocumented immigrants who are already living within the U.S. as opposed to just focusing on border crossings.
Yeah.
And this strategy really resonated with his base, who felt that this prioritized, the rule of law.
So it wasn't just about, the physical wall.
Exactly.
It was about changing the entire approach.
Yeah, the whole approach to immigration enforcement. And while the wall itself became this huge symbol, it's important to remember that only a small portion of it was actually built during his term.
Wow.
Faced a lot of legal and budgetary hurdles.
So a big swing, but not a complete home run.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Kind of makes me think of his approach to foreign policy, too, particularly with North Korea.
Yeah.
He had those really unprecedented meetings with Kim Jong-un. What was the real takeaway there?
Well, that's a fascinating case study. While the meetings were undoubtedly historic, I mean, just the optics of a U.S. president sitting down with the leader of North Korea, that's undeniably powerful. The question is, did they lead to any kind of concrete progress on denuclearization?
Right.
And I think, the answer is complex.
Okay.
A lot of experts suggest that North Korea actually continued to develop their nuclear program despite these diplomatic efforts, which led some people to argue that those meetings were really more about spectacle than substance.
Wow, so a mixed bag on the foreign policy front. But his supporters would likely argue that just having those conversations, was a step in the right direction.
Yeah, and that's a valid point. Diplomacy, even when it doesn't yield immediate, measurable results, can lay the groundwork for future progress. It's like, planting a seed. It may take time to see if it truly bears fruit.
That's a good analogy. So far, we're seeing this pattern of, bold moves, some with more tangible results than others. What other areas of his presidency should we dig into?
Well, I don't think we can really talk about Trump's achievements without looking at the economy. He took office promising to boost growth, create jobs, and bring back manufacturing to the U.S.
Yeah, sounds like a tall order. Did he deliver?
That's where we'll pick up in part 2. We'll delve into the economic policies that he implemented, the successes that he claimed, and the criticisms that he faced. It's a nuanced picture, as with many things, with both positive and negative indicators to consider.
I'm intrigued to see how it all shakes out. See you in part 2.
Absolutely. Okay, so picking up where we left off, let's dive a little deeper into the economic landscape during Trump's presidency. He came in, like a wrecking ball, right? Promising to shake things up and really put America back on top.
And make America great again. That was his slogan.
Yeah.
But what did that actually mean in terms of actual policies?
Yeah, so one of his signature moves was this thing called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. And it was this sweeping piece of legislation that slashed corporate tax rates.
Okay.
And offered, tax breaks to individuals and businesses.
So essentially putting more money back in people's pockets and giving companies more incentive to invest and grow. Did it work?
Well, the answer, as with most things in economics, isn't a simple yes or no. Looking at the sources, it's really a mixed bag of results. So we did see this surge in economic growth in the immediate aftermath. Unemployment rates hit, historic lows. But, critics would argue that the benefits really disproportionately favored the wealthy and corporations, and maybe even exacerbated income inequality.
Yeah, the age-old trickle-down debate. Feels like every administration kind of grapples with that.
Yeah, definitely.
But
And Trump was no exception. He also really went after these trade deals, which is something we touched on earlier with the USMCA. Remember how he framed these agreements as bad deals for America, hurting our workers and our industries.
yeah, he definitely wasn't afraid to ruffle some feathers on the world stage. What were some of the other key moves in his trade strategy?
Well, the big one was, of course, his trade war with China.
Oh, right.
Which, he slapped these tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. And the goal was to, try to level the playing field and protect American jobs.
This was a major gamble, wasn't it?
Yeah.
What did our sources say about the fallout from that?
It was a very high-stakes move, for sure. The sources highlight that while the tariffs did put some pressure on China, they also led to increased costs for American businesses and consumers.
Oh, interesting.
And actually, the trade deficit widened during his term, which kind of raises questions about, the long-term effectiveness of that approach.
So, bit of a boomerang effect. It seemed like Trump was always willing to play hardball, whether it was on trade or immigration or even with his own party sometimes.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. He often took this combative stance, challenging long-held norms and institutions, and it really resonated with his base who saw him as this disruptor,
Yeah.
fight for the forgotten man, as he would say.
Right. And that actually brings us to another major achievement, one that kind of often gets lost in the noise, and that is his deregulation efforts.
Yes. This was a quieter, but, still significant part of his agenda, and he really targeted regulations across various sectors, arguing that they were stifling economic growth and job creation.
So the idea being less red tape, more freedom for businesses to operate. Did his supporters see this as a win?
Absolutely, yeah. The sources indicate that his deregulation drive was a big hit with his base, particularly those in, industries like energy and manufacturing who felt, overregulated.
Right, but I imagine this probably sparks some pushback too, especially from environmental groups.
Yeah, definitely. Critics argued that rolling back things like environmental protections and consumer safety regulations posed, significant risks to public health and long-term sustainability. It's a classic example of that tension between economic growth and regulatory oversight.
Right, yeah. So another area where Trump's actions really triggered some heated debate. It seems like every move he made had both passionate supporters and really fierce critics.
I think that's really the essence of his presidency, isn't it? He was this polarizing figure who really divided the nation, even on issues that, traditionally had enjoyed bipartisan support.
Yeah. We've covered a lot of ground here from tax cuts and trade wars to deregulation and Supreme Court appointments. But there's one more elephant in the room that we really need to address. His handling of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes. That was a defining moment, for better or for worse. This really threw a massive wrench into his economic agenda and became this huge flashpoint for controversy. Shall we unpack that in part 3?
Definitely. That was a period of intense uncertainty and just upheaval. I'm eager to dive into these sources and see how it all played out. See you in part 3.
All right, so we talked about a lot of Trump's pre-pandemic economic policies, like tax cuts and deregulation and trade wars, and then 2020 hits and COVID-19 arrives and kind of changes everything. So how did he deal with this crisis? No one had ever really dealt with anything like this before. Yeah, this was a huge moment, like a real defining moment for every world leader, I think. And looking back at the sources, you really get a picture of a president who is grappling with this situation that is changing so fast. And it just didn't fit into like his existing playbook. You know what I mean?
Right. I mean, his
So,
approach to governing, it was bold, it was brash,
yeah, yeah.
So how did that translate into a global health crisis?
Well, I think initially he really downplayed how severe the virus was. He was emphasizing the need to keep the economy stable and avoid like mass panic. And you have to remember that he'd really staked his presidency on a strong economy, and a sudden shutdown, threatened to undo all of that.
So it's like his economic priorities were kind of butting heads with the huge public health concern. Did his stance change at all as things went on?
Yeah, it did. Um, but not without a lot of controversy. I mean, if you look at the sources, he was clashing a lot with public health experts, and he was promoting treatments that were not proven, and he was questioning whether masks even worked, and so his messaging was just all over the place, which I think caused a lot of confusion and frustration.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was such a confusing time, right? So much conflicting information. I think a lot of leaders around the world struggled with figuring out how to handle all of it.
Absolutely, yeah. And Trump's approach, I mean, he was always a little bit skeptical of experts, and he was prone to just kind of going with his gut, and that didn't always work out so well in a crisis like this, where you really needed clear, consistent communication, and you really needed to be listening to what the scientists were saying.
Right. So how did his supporters feel about all this? How did they react to his handling of the pandemic?
Well, it seems like, from what the sources say, it was kind of a mixed bag. Some of them, they really stuck with him and they were praising his efforts to try to reopen the economy quickly.
Yeah.
But others, they started to get disillusioned, especially as the death toll went up and the economy got worse.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's almost like his America First rhetoric, which works so well for him in a lot of other areas. It didn't really fit this situation where you really needed to work together with other countries.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, a global crisis like this just really showed how interconnected the world is, and that didn't really line up with his more nationalist agenda.
Right. And we can't really talk about the later part of his presidency without talking about the 2020 election.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, he refused to concede. And then the things that happened after that, it was like nothing we'd ever seen before.
Yeah, for sure. That was a crazy time. It really shook like the foundation of American democracy. And Trump just kept saying that there was all this voter fraud, but he never had any proof. And his claims were rejected by courts and election officials, from both parties.
And it all kind of culminated in that attack on the Capitol on January 6th.
Yeah.
That was a really dark day.
Yeah, it was. It was really shocking to see that level of political violence. And it was really fueled by all that misinformation and all that anger that had been building up.
Yeah.
And it just showed how fragile, our democratic norms are, and how dangerous it can be when you undermine people's faith in the system.
So looking back at Trump's presidency, as a whole now, what are the big takeaways? I mean, what's the lasting impact of all of this? The achievements, the controversies, just his whole unconventional style.
Well, I think there's no question that he left a permanent mark on American politics. He reshaped the Supreme Court. He rewrote all these trade deals. He made huge changes to immigration policy. But at the same time, he also caused some really deep divisions. He eroded trust in our institutions, and he challenged like all the norms of how a president is supposed to behave.
Yeah, it's a complicated legacy for sure, and one that I think people are going to be talking about for a long time to come.
Exactly. He was a disruptor, he was a showman, he was an amazing communicator, and he was able to tap into this feeling of discontent, that was out there, and he turned it into this really powerful political movement. So whether you love him or hate him, you can't deny that his presidency was a real turning point in American history.
Well, folks, that's definitely something to think about. As you continue to learn about this fascinating and really important figure in our history. Thanks for diving deep with us.